So, as you heard, my name's Kevin Gover. I'm the director of the National Museum of the American Indian. If I lapse into jargon, I'll say NMAI because it sort of rolls off my tongue now. But that's our museum. The NMAI is a Smithsonian museum. We were the, I believe, the 19th of the now 20 museums and research centers that are part of the Smithsonian system. It is by far the largest museum complex in the world. Most of our museums are located in Washington, but not all. Our most recent addition to the Smithsonian was the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So as you heard, I am the director of the museum. What might surprise you about me is that I was trained as a lawyer. I went to law school and actually practiced law for a number of years and really liked it. I can't yet account for why I'm not still a lawyer, except that I got this opportunity to come to the Smithsonian and run the National Museum of the American Indian. Let me give you a brief history of our museum. In the early 1900s, there was a wealthy New Yorker named George Gustav High. And Mr. High was part of the Standard Oil fortune. That seems to be where he made his money. But he developed, for reasons we haven't quite teased out, a passion for collecting Native American ethnographic material. Now, what was going on at this time in the world, or in the Native world, was that there was a presumption that Native Americans would soon fade into history and that there would no longer be American Indians in the United States. Not only was that thought to be true, it was quite deliberately hoped that it would be true by the federal government, and the policies that the government set up at the time were really intended to see that the tribes simply faded away, and that Native Americans would no longer be a distinct part of the American population. It wasn't so much extermination as it was assimilation, and it was quite literally called an assimilation policy. So the anthropologists and scholars of the time, these are the folks that brought us such insights as the race science, where they were measuring skulls to determine the brain pan capacity of the different races, and from that drawing some pretty broad conclusions about the intelligence of the different races. But these fellows were in a near panic because if Indians were going to go away, there was not any time to lose in collecting their material culture and learning about these societies that they had created. So Mr. High was a part of that movement that we now call salvage anthropology, and spent his fortune moving around not just the United States, but also Canada and Central and South America, collecting what remained of Native American material culture at that time. So much so that he managed to collect by the mid-1900s a collection of around 800,000 items. At first he was keeping all of these things in his apartment there in New York, which we have to assume was a fairly large apartment, but a few 100,000 items would be a little much for anyone. So his wife said, you know, this isn't working. It's either these things have to go or I have to go. So his second wife, fortunately, was more open to his passion. And we have some cute pictures of them out on archaeological expeditions together, you know, wearing the pith helmets and everything. Very much a love story. So Mr. High opened his museum in New York City in 1916. And he passed away in the 1950s and left really a quite handsomely endowed museum behind with one of the, if not the greatest collection of Native American material in the world. And a good endowment for continuing operations. Unfortunately, by the 1980s, the character of the neighborhood where he had built this museum, this was at 155th Street and Broadway in New York, was not what it once was, and attendance at the museum collapsed. And they were still dependent on charging people to get into their museum in order to finance operations. So long story short, the collection was in some considerable risk of being broken apart and sold. It was at that point that there were several Native American members of the board of the Museum of the American Indian, and they very much wanted to see this collection not just rescued, but that it become the backbone of a new Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And so after a lot of haggling and a lot of drama and a lot of politics, the powers that be in New York City, New York State, the U.S. Senate, and the House of Representatives, and finally the Smithsonian Institution itself, came together and struck a grand bargain by which the assets of the High Foundation's museum, the Museum of the American Indian, would be transferred to the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian would establish a National Museum of the American Indian. There were two important conditions for our purposes. One was that the Smithsonian and the National Museum of the American Indian always have a location in New York City. And so we are the only Smithsonian museum with separate locations in both Washington and New York. Our New York location, for those of you who travel to New York, is down by Battery Park. It's in the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House, which is a glorious old Beaux-Arts building literally across the street from Battery Park. It was also a condition that the Smithsonian would build a state-of-the-art facility for the care and maintenance of the High Collection. And the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian, did that. We have a beautiful facility in Suitland, Maryland, just outside of Washington, which is now home to Mr. High's collection. And then finally, the advocacy of the Native American people on the board required that there be a museum on the National Mall. Now, that was no small matter, because at that time it was thought there was only one place on the National Mall where there would be another Smithsonian museum, and that's at the corner of 3rd Street and Independence Avenue. The Smithsonian had in mind that they were there going to build what was quaintly referred to back in the 1980s as a Museum of Man. What that really is, aside from the sexist title, is an anthropology museum to examine cultures from all over the world, blah, blah, blah. So it would have been just another anthropology museum, but it would be a Smithsonian anthropology museum, so it's no small matter. Over time, the Smithsonian was persuaded that its interest lay with having a National Museum of the American Indian. There were some very powerful members of Congress who supported the idea and basically told the Smithsonian, you are going to do this. And eventually the Smithsonian agreed. And so the National Museum of the American Indian was established by Congress in 1989. We opened our museum in New York in 1994, opened the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, the home of the collections, in 1999, and opened our museum on the National Mall in 2004. On the day of the opening of the museum on the National Mall, they estimate there were about 25,000 Native Americans from all over North, South, and Central America who attended that opening, and it was really quite a sight. Newspapers being what they are, they were saying things like, this is the most Indians that have ever been in this area. And of course, there's no way for us to know that, but you know, it's the thought that counts, I suppose. So we'll just kind of go with it. So that's how we came to be. The museum is doing all the things you would expect a museum to do in this day and age. We, of course, take good care of our collections. We have exhibitions in both of our museums. Between the two, we draw about a little short of 2 million visitors a year come to our museums. We do programs, cultural arts programs, as well as educational programs. We have an online presence that we're constantly trying to upgrade and make a lot more vibrant. But we are now very much a mainstream museum. The museum did accomplish two extraordinarily important things in its early years. One was that under the legislation that established the museum, both the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of Natural History, which is one of the oldest museums in the system, were required to begin immediately returning to Native American communities human remains that originated in those communities. The Smithsonian had collections of something like 18,000 sets of human remains that had been collected mostly in the late 19th century. Many of them from battlefields, many of them from graveyards that were identified as the country moved west. And they were dug up, packaged up, and sent back to Washington to be a part of the collections of the Smithsonian. When Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii learned about this, he was mortified and outraged. And it wasn't much challenged that those things, those remains, should be returned to their originating communities. The mandate was later expanded to include sacred objects that were in the possession of the Smithsonian and objects of cultural patrimony. And so both of the two museums now, Natural History and American Indian, maintain active repatriation programs, and we are returning things that, in all honesty, never should have left those communities. So it's an interesting exercise in trying to correct a historical wrong. The other thing the museum did that I think is tremendously important, and that now seems a little bit, again, rather quaint, is the idea that Native American people themselves ought to be involved in the interpretation of their material culture and their history. Now that hopefully seems really, really obvious to all of you, that that is as it should be, but it was a genuinely revolutionary concept in the early 1990s, because traditionally the practice had been that experts, almost all non-Indian experts, would study the material culture of a community and go out and interview the Indian people, and then come back and report to the world, this is who these people are, and these are the things they believe in, and this is why they do things the way they do. Well, it probably doesn't surprise you to learn that they quite often, perhaps even most of the time, got it wrong. Because when you don't actually involve Native people directly in the curation of this material, you're almost certainly going to get large parts of it wrong. Nevertheless, it was museum practice throughout the country, and still is in places like Europe, that non-Indian experts would be given the authority to interpret Native American culture. The museum came out of the blocks basically saying that's wrong. That is exactly the wrong way to do it. The only legitimate way, the only proper scholarly method for examining these cultures and this material is to involve Native American people themselves directly in that interpretation. And what seemed like a radical concept 25 years ago is now very much mainstream museum practice. And I think while that movement had begun before the NMAI came into existence, it certainly accelerated. And the fact that it was a Smithsonian museum that was saying these things really made all the difference in getting the museum world to change its ways. So we do all the usual things that a museum does. We have lots of wonderful exhibitions, and we quarrel with the critics over whether they're good or not. But what I want to talk more about is how we're trying to reach out beyond the museum walls. Obviously, that takes place through technology, and I will hasten to add that we are in no way, shape, or form at this time masters of the technology. The Smithsonian somehow managed to fall 10 or 15 years behind the rest of the world. And it really is quite curious to me. I came aboard at the museum in 2007, not that I'm a technological expert, but I was surprised to see that we were doing little more than the basics at the Smithsonian. Everybody had a website, you know. I sort of think about the Smithsonian in the 90s and thinking how amazed everybody must have been at something like, you know, email, because this is an old place. It will be celebrating its 175th anniversary in 2021, I believe. And there's a reason that the dinosaur exhibit at the Smithsonian is so famous because it sort of, you know, embodies the essence of how we are, especially when it comes to technology. But having said that, we are trying to do better. One of our projects is called Native Knowledge 360. And this is an attempt to address what Olivia was talking about, that Native American students are not doing well. And I believe much of the reason they're not doing well is that they simply don't see themselves in the curriculum as it's being taught now. When I was growing up and learning in school, I remember not learning a single thing in school that made me proud of my ancestors. And I think that was the experience of most people my age. And it was distressing when we undertook a study of the textbooks that are in use across the country to learn that they really haven't changed very much. There might be just a smidge more material, but Native Americans still disappear from the history books around 1900 and never to be seen or heard from again, almost as though the American policy of assimilation had succeeded in doing away with all the Indians. At the same time, weirdly, our visitors don't come to our museums as blank slates. They come there knowing something about Indians because there are still things about Indians sort of out in the ether. Certainly there is in the curriculum of the public schools and in the popular culture. There's still a lot about Indians. And of course, the problem is that those ideas, when they're not incomplete, are almost entirely false. But our visitors come to the museum believing them and thinking that I know all about this. And museum visitors are kind of weird because one of the reasons they come to a museum is they want to see what they already know confirmed by an authority. And interestingly, museums are still regarded as one of the most authoritative and credible institutions in the country, while many others have suffered quite dramatically, whether it be our political bodies or the media, even universities. Museums are still kind of held in very high regard. And so if you go to a museum and you see something and you can say, yeah, I knew that, then that makes you a really smart guy, right? And so we had to deal with visitors who were coming to our museum and saying, what is this? We have no idea what this is, because we weren't sort of playing to the things they already know. And it doesn't just bewilder them, it kind of makes them mad, you know, and is off-putting to them. So we began thinking about, well, you know, one possible response we could have is, hey, we're the experts now, and so just shut up and listen. That's usually not the road to persuading somebody of what you're trying to say. And so we thought, well, let's maybe talk about these stories that they know and see if we can help them gain more understanding by that method. So you probably all know the stories that I'm going to talk about. If you had to say, what are the 5 things every American knows about Native American history, most often they're going to include things like the first Thanksgiving, of course. That, by the way, is why November is Native American Heritage Month, isn't it? Because this is the time of year when we all, when we think about Indians, right? Another would be Pocahontas. And you notice how sturdy Pocahontas' presence in the American culture is when she's back in the news, and it's 2018, when she died nearly 400 years ago. Some of the other stories would be Little Bighorn, of course, which is weird because it was a crushing defeat for the American Army, and yet people love the story about Little Bighorn. And we're really curious about that. In fact, I think of some of our work as being, we're doing anthropology on white people to try to understand their strange beliefs, and their strange culture, and how they view themselves. And that's kind of fun for us. So seriously, we started thinking about, well, why are these stories so powerful? One of the things that we began thinking about is every culture has origin myths. Every culture has a way of saying, this is where we come from, and because that's about who we are, right, as a people. So we started thinking about origin myths of the United States. And if you thought about it for just a minute, you would come up with several of them, right? Certainly Columbus discovering America. That's part of the American origin myth. Even though Columbus never set foot in North America, he is still claimed as the discoverer of America. But others, maybe a little more subtle, are things like the first Thanksgiving, right? If you're in New England, that is the American origin myth in New England. Everybody knows about the first Thanksgiving. Everybody knows where Plymouth is. Everybody knows, the story of Squanto, the friendly Indian, who taught the Pilgrims to grow corn, blah, blah, blah. In our part of the world, down in the D.C. area, the mid-Atlantic, the origin myth is Pocahontas in Jamestown. And everybody knows the story of Pocahontas in that part of the country. And I got curious as we sort of move across the country, the origin myths are always different, and they're changing. So here in California, there are a couple of very powerful origin myths. One is the Spanish missions spreading up and down the state. But the other, of course, is the gold rush. And these are California's origin stories. It explains how the state came to be and why we're so special because we're the descendants of these people who did these things. So anyway, so we're thinking about, okay, well, this is why they know those stories. What is it about those stories that's so special? By the way, we know that, these are origin myths of the United States because if you go into into the Capitol of the United States, in the rotunda, the castle's what we refer to Smithsonian headquarters as. It's the red castle building, so that was a slip of the tongue. In the Capitol, in the rotunda, there are 8 very large paintings sort of circling around the Capitol rotunda. And of those, several involve Indians. One, the most striking perhaps, is there's a huge painting of the baptism of Pocahontas. So Pocahontas is clearly a founding mother of the United States. Another is the embarkation of the Pilgrims. It wasn't the first Thanksgiving, it was when the Pilgrims left Europe to come to the New World seeking religious liberty. Another, my personal favorite, is DeSoto discovering the Mississippi. And it's an interesting painting because there's a whole Indian village there that DeSoto is standing in. And I thought, and they never noticed the Mississippi River right there? So DeSoto discovers the Mississippi. Anyway, these are origin myths, right? And these are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that make us feel special. So let's start looking at a couple of them. One is the first Thanksgiving. We all know the story. The Pilgrims arrived. They almost starved to death that first winter. Then the friendly Indian Squanto shows up to teach them how to grow corn and later that year, they're thriving and they're happy and they're well fed, and they decide, let's have our Indian friends over for a harvest feast at the end of our first year to give thanks for our good fortune. So that's a fine story, right? Kind of makes you feel good. There's a hardiness of these first Americans that have arrived, and they were fleeing religious bigotry. There's even a touch of racial harmony in the story, and so it's like, yeah, that's who we are. This is part of us. Well, as you would expect, because we are, after all, just human beings, it's a little more complex and a lot more messy than that. But it is a really cool story. And so it's true, the Pilgrims arrived. Why you would want to land in a new world in a climate like that in November is quite beyond me. But that's what they did, and so naturally they almost starved to death because they weren't able to grow food that year. What they did do was find the stashes, the winter stashes of corn that a nearby Wampanoag village had stored, and they literally survived on this. And you're asking, so why did the Wampanoags let them have all that corn? They were all dead. They had died. A smallpox epidemic had moved through the area immediately before the arrival of the Pilgrims. And so there it was, there for the taking. A second element of the story is Squanto himself. Does everybody know about Squanto? Did everybody learn that story? No, okay. Well, Squanto is the famous friendly Indian, right? Well, his real name was Tisquantum. And he wasn't quite as friendly as they make him out to be, but he's an interesting guy because when the Pilgrims arrived, Tisquantum spoke English. Now, how did that happen, right? The Pilgrims were supposed to be the first Englishmen to show up in the New World, and there's this Indian guy going, hey, what's up? That would have freaked me out if I were one of them, right? So, but yeah. What had happened is Tisquantum had been kidnapped and taken aboard an English fishing boat, and they were fishing the North Atlantic at the time, carried back to Europe as a slave, and later was redeemed. The crown was dismayed when they learned that this had happened. And he made his way back. He was brought back to his town there in Massachusetts, only to discover that they had been wiped out by smallpox. So now Tisquantum is there, and he becomes the go-between between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Confederacy in the area. So now we've got a more interesting story, right? Because it wasn't just Squanto the friendly Indian comes in and grunts and does sign language to communicate. But in fact, he's negotiating with them and engaging literally in diplomacy with these newcomers who were welcomed by the Wampanoags because the Wampanoags had just suffered mightily in the smallpox epidemic, and the surrounding tribes and confederacies smelled their weakness. And so the Wampanoags needed allies, and the Pilgrims could be very formidable allies. And so they did. So, and as it happens, a year later, they did, in fact, have a meal together, have a celebration, with both sides bringing food and just having a good old time. They played a little football, as we do now. And it was great. It was great. A good time was had by all. But it didn't happen the year after that. I mean, there wasn't an annual Thanksgiving feast where they're going, hey, remember when we had the Indians come over? Let's do that again this year. It didn't happen. So this thing happened in 1621, and it was literally 200 years before it actually came to the attention of the American people again as a thing. And they found an old journal that was kept by one of the Pilgrims, And this old journal, in a single sentence, a single phrase, said the Indians came over and we had a feast. That's it. That's all that was said about it. But now we have this whole Thanksgiving industrial complex built up, right? Where we all know what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to eat a lot on Thursday, shop a lot on Friday, watch football on Saturday and Sunday, because that's what you do if you're an American. And we base it all on this thing that happened in 1621. And so that's sort of interesting how all of that works. The rest of the story is not quite so happy, and it kind of blows up the Thanksgiving thing, because about 40 years later, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags engaged in what was probably the most devastating war ever fought in North America, devastating in terms of the percentage of the two peoples that were killed in the engagement. It was called King Philip's War. There came a point where the Pilgrims and their successors kept coming and saying, we need a little more land, can you hook us up? And the Wampanoags are going, well, you know, we're getting really short, but damn, that's some nice stuff you're offering us, so we're going to take it. Until the point came where the Wampanoags could no longer survive on the land that they had. And the Pilgrims were not showing any interest in being helpful to them at that point, because they had what they wanted. And so there was a war, and it was absolutely devastating to the New England tribes. The chief of the Wampanoags, King Philip, as he was called by the English, was ultimately captured. His head was put on a pike at the entrance to Plymouth and stayed there for 20 years. And so that's not the same story as the first Thanksgiving, right? But they're really inseparable. And it seems like we should know all of those things. Let me tell you one more that's a little bit, well, maybe a little bit more uplifting. And that is the story of Pocahontas. So Pocahontas was real, but if you learned it the way I did, we all know that Pocahontas saved John Smith from the Jamestown colony from being executed by her evil father, Powhatan, and went on to marry him. And so here again, we have all these cool elements of a good origin myth, right? We have this interracial harmony idea again, and you know, we have a love story to boot. So this is a good story, and you know, you have a beautiful young Indian woman in her buckskin cocktail dress, you know, talking to animals and singing songs, and so it's nice, right? But I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that's not quite what happened. As it happens, Pocahontas was 11 years old when she first met John Smith, who was 28 at the time. There was, in fact, an engagement between the Powhatan Confederacy and the Jamestown colonists, who survived only because they were provided food by the Indians. But the rest of it is a lot messier than we might hope. Pocahontas did not, in fact, marry John Smith, and historians now agree that it's extraordinarily unlikely that she saved his life from being executed for two reasons. The only written source for this story was a book that John Smith himself wrote. And I'm afraid he was known to be a terrible liar, and the hero, of course, of every one of his stories. So there's reason to be skeptical. The other thing, though, is that he wrote a book about a similar adventure in the Middle East where, would you believe it, the exact same thing happened, where a local princess saved him from being executed by her evil father. And so that struck everybody as probably not true. So none of that happened. What did happen, though, was that Pocahontas married a man named John Rolfe. She did convert to Christianity. The sources are mixed, and different people would tell you different stories about just how voluntary her conversion was. But she did convert and was baptized. And so there it is in the Capitol Rotunda, the baptism of Pocahontas. She looks very lovely in her white gown, and the sun is shining through the window right down upon her. So we're all good here. We're all good. It was another good story. Pocahontas then went with her husband to England, where they had a child, Thomas Rolfe. And upon setting out to return to America, Pocahontas fell ill and died at the age of 23. So that's seems like the end of the story, right? Well, Pocahontas lives on. So why is that exactly? Well, if you go to Virginia, where I now live, and you throw a stone down pretty much any street, you're going to hit at least one person who says they are a direct descendant of Pocahontas. And this is fascinating, right? Because it tells us a couple of things. But one of them is that people feel this interesting need to connect somehow to the Native American, to a Native American heritage. In Virginia, they had a huge society of people who labored mightily to establish that they were in fact descendants of Pocahontas. And I mean, by the thousands, there are members of the society. And this became, all the first families of Virginia wanted to prove they were descended from Pocahontas. And they'd pull out the books and records and all that, and finally, put in an application. If you got in, you were like an uber Virginian. You weren't just a Virginian. I mean, you were like, you were as good as it gets. 4 of the first 6 presidents come from Virginia. So this is no small matter. These were the aristocrats of the United States, and they wanted to be known as descendants from Pocahontas. Well, I'll skip past the fate of the Powhatan Confederacy, except to ask you, when's the last time you heard about the Powhatan Confederacy? In 1924, the state of Virginia started thinking about its Jim Crow laws and decided they needed a little brushing up. So they passed a law called the Racial Integrity Act. Now, under the Racial Integrity Act, there were only 2 kinds of people in Virginia, and it determined their legal status, and it's what would show on any public records regarding their existence. You had white people, and you had colored people. Now, colored people were, black people, Indians, Asians, anybody who wasn't 100% white. And they meant that, 100%. If there was any other ancestry in your line, then you were colored. And needless to say, it was disadvantageous under Virginia law to be colored. But then they thought, wait a minute, we have all of our aristocratic families have worked very hard to establish they're descended from Pocahontas. And so they are all colored. Isn't that awesome? Well, they were too clever to let that stand. So they passed a law that said, except if you're 1/16 or less Native American, then you can still be a white person under Virginia law. And they called it the Pocahontas exception. So you see, Pocahontas has some real staying power, right? Pocahontas is still making news in the 1920s. So fast forward to the 1960s, and Jim Crow is still in effect. The Racial Integrity Act is still law. And one of the provisions is that white people and colored people may not marry one another in the state of Virginia. This law was challenged by a couple named Mildred and Richard Loving. Now, if you read Mildred Loving's obituary in the New York Times, it says that Mildred Loving identified herself as a Rappahannock Indian. And in the part of the state where she came from, that's not far-fetched at all. People were there and mixing for 400 years by that point. And so, but Mildred thought of herself as a Rappahannock Indian, not even as an African American. So, although she was clearly of African American descent as well. So Richard and Mildred challenged the law. Lo and behold, the Supreme Court in 1967 strikes down the prohibition on interracial marriage in Virginia and everywhere else. Now that may seem like a long time ago to some of you, but not so much to me, because my parents moved to Virginia in 1970. If we'd moved there 3 years earlier, their marriage would have been prohibited under the laws of the state of Virginia. So it's not all that long ago that these things were going on. Then, of course, in the 1990s, Pocahontas had a good year in 1995. She's back in the news, back in the popular culture. Disney makes a movie about her. It's awesome. All the little girls could sing the song, you know, where the wind's blowing through her hair, and she's grappling with the moral dilemma of what her obligations are to her own people as opposed to these lovely new people from England. And that becomes, once again, the story of Pocahontas. So you see how really powerful these stories are. They keep coming back. And it's just really interesting to me that, setting aside, you know, that it's such insulting behavior, that when looking for a name, everybody would recognize to hurl as an insult against a non-Indian pretending to be an Indian, the president would land on Pocahontas. So it just gives you an idea of how deeply ingrained this stuff is. So what we're saying, there are other origin stories that we could go into. The Trail of Tears in the Southeast is part of their origin story. As I said, the Indian Wars and Little Bighorn in particular, and here, the Gold Rush. We want to do two things. We know teachers are teaching about these things. And because of the material that's available to them, we don't expect them to go out and do the research and learn all this stuff. They're kind of busy people. They're still teaching it badly, given what they've got to work with. But the second thing is there's a larger concern for for all of us really, that history is being taught in this way, that these stories continue to be taught as they were 100 years ago and 200 years ago, when the truth is much more complicated. And especially in our increasingly diverse world, the least we can do, it seems to me, is tell our origin stories in a way that are more inclusive. Now, this is very difficult. This is it sounds easy, but it's really hard when you're trying to construct a narrative. And so we are grappling with that right now, as are other museums, in how to tell stories in a way that is genuinely inclusive and tremendously complex. You know, we don't have a lot to work with sometimes in telling a story. Nobody wants to stand there and read what I just told you on a wall in a museum. That's just, you know, that's incredibly boring, and the visitors won't do it. Most of our text, we've got about 150 words to work with to make usually a pretty complicated point. So we need to get good at that, though. That's the challenge that's before us. But more generally, we need people to be a lot more interested in the complexities of history and not just accept these simple narratives. The reason our current political discourse sometimes seems so stupid and ignorant is because American students have not been taught things that are true about their country. And so one of the ways that I've learned to think about it, and I'm not always good at it, but I try, is to basically put myself in their shoes and say, you know, the things that these people believe about our country are things I used to believe about our country, because that's what I was taught, and that's what I pick up in the popular culture. And so we should be both humble and generous in thinking about it and in talking about it to others who are going to be, let's face it, they're going to resist this idea, because these heroic narratives are, did I lose my mic? These heroic narratives are so much more satisfying, and whereas the true stories leave us just a little unsettled. But I suggest that maybe unsettled is the way we should be. So I'm going to stop right there. And by the way, these are the stories we need to move into the classroom. Now, we don't want to be teaching fourth graders about mayhem and murder, but neither should we let them let their only encounter with Native American history be a happy, happy story of happy Indians and white people all getting along. We need to start teaching them early that it's complicated, you know, and they were just people, just like us. And they did good things, they did bad things. And we should know about all of them if we're to draw true lessons from the history. So I'm going to stop and see if anyone would like to ask some questions. Or if you'd like me to just leave, it'd be okay.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I had a question. Are there any lesson plans that you've either prepared for teachers or lesson plans that others have prepared but that you endorse?
Oh, both good questions. Yes, we have, there are lesson plans on our website, nmei.si.edu. And that's the museum's website. It's under, well, there's a tile for NK360 or Native Knowledge 360. But there's only a few, and so we are trying to populate that. I mean, we need dozens in order for it to be adequate, and we're working on that. As for others that we endorse, we haven't yet, but they are out there. We've seen some good material, and another phase in the project will be to add those, at least add links to those resources to the things we're putting online. Sir?
So there seems to be a lot of whitewashing of the history, like even the terminology like American Indian seems really whitewashed.
Yeah.
The types of stories, it's usually related to like pilgrims or European colonists or something like that. Are there any efforts to preserve just like truly native stories?
Oh, yeah. Sure. You know, the Indian nations have origin myths of their own. And those don't involve Columbus or pilgrims or anything like that. So yeah, those stories are there, and one thing I will credit the anthropologists of the late 19th and early 20th century with is they were incredibly inquisitive, and they did collect a lot of stuff. And so to the extent those stories did not survive in the oral tradition within the community, they did survive in some of these library resources. So yeah.
I think you started to get into this just a little bit at the very end, but I was wondering if you had any more, any more thoughts on how you would introduce these stories to children at a younger age and at a time when they, really aren't able to absorb the complexity of it, but there's some introduction there to build on later, because certainly my experience is that the largest portion of Native American history I learned was probably in 2nd through 5th grade, and then I spent time slowly unlearning it, but they talked about it less, so it was kind of, and I grew up in Massachusetts too, so the whole, Pilgrim's First Thanksgiving was a big thing that we would celebrate in elementary school.
Yeah, so first of all, I should quickly say I am not an educator and certainly not an elementary school educator. We think about this all the time. I'll give you a great example. I was here a couple of years ago up in Sonoma County. And in Sonoma, there is a mission still standing, the Sonoma Mission, which is a state park. It's the only one of the Catholic missions that was not returned to the church. So if you go in there, there's a little exhibit with a little bit of history about it. They note, that the Indians were not always well treated, but they don't really focus on it. But the real problem is that there was a group of kids playing out in the courtyard of the mission, and so I go out to see what's going on, and it looked like it was a 4th grade class that was there to visit the mission and learn some history. The teachers and the chaperones were dressed up as priests, as if they were, the priests of the mission. which meant that the kids who were there visiting were the Indians. And some of them, in fact, dressed up as Indians. And so they were going from station to station playing. They were making candles, and they were weaving baskets, and they were spinning wool and that sort of thing. And I thought, again, you don't want to take fourth graders down the road of murder and rape. On the other hand, there's no way they should be left. This will be their only exposure to Indians for probably quite some time in their formal education. They shouldn't go away thinking that the missions were fun for the Indians, right? Now, there are ways to teach, and you sort of pose questions to children and say, so what must that have been like, for a child to be taken from their parents and made to work in a mission? What would that be like, to have to work so many hours a day, growing food or doing whatever? And so, there are ways to do it, and we should do it. We should do it. Because you know what? It sucks for those little kids later when they begin to learn, as I did, that it wasn't a happy story, and that can be really quite disconcerting.
So thank you for the talk. How does the museum deal with this struggle between telling the visitors the history and connecting them to the current American Indians who are living in the reserve and struggling the North Dakota, the Keystone Pipeline, and there is modern issues that actual people who are living. I feel like sometimes going to the museum, when you are not the powerful part of the story, it feels like we are mythical creatures and these people disappeared, never exist anymore. And the history being good or bad, it's history. And how does the museum connect them to, no, these people are actually real people living right now and suffering as they used to suffer. How does the museum deal with that? How
That's a great question. It's the right question, too. So one of the consequences of involving Native people themselves in the interpretation of the material is that they won't leave it at this is the way it used to be. They always want to say this is how we are now. One way I could have told the end of the Pocahontas story might be that in the past 2 years, 8 tribes in Virginia were finally accorded recognition by the United States as Indian nations. They had gone the entire history of the United States, despite having obviously been there from time immemorial, without being recognized by the federal government or eligible for the services that other Indians received. So they're still there, and they're still working and trying to succeed as Native people. The other thing, though, is we in our exhibitions try not to leave them in the past too. So we have an exhibition about the history of treaties between the United States and the Native nations. The last portion of the exhibit actually is there was a mile marker at the Standing Rock camp where all these different people were putting up, the names of their tribes and point a direction and say how many miles it was to where they were from. They gave it to us. And so that is in our exhibition about treaties, where we're saying treaties still exist, Native people still exist, this relationship still exists. And so now it's on us, who are here now, to say what the next chapter is going to be. It's not hard, right? Indians are generally invisible in contemporary American society, but you just have to know where to look, because they're not invisible to us, and they're certainly not invisible in our museum. Most of our art exhibitions are actually contemporary Native art, and it's as beautiful and as weird as other contemporary art is.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your questions.